World War II is often remembered as the last war with moral clarity, a conflict where the lines between right and wrong were supposedly drawn in blood and ash. But that clarity was manufactured after the fact, assembled from carefully selected evidence and strategic omissions. What actually happened between 1939 and 1945 was far more tangled, procedural, and disturbingly efficient than the sanitized narrative allows. This is not a story about heroes and villains. This is about how industrial societies organized mass death with the same attention to detail they used to build railroads and manage payroll. The horror was not in the madness. The horror was in how normal it all became. When Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939, the event that supposedly began the war, the Polish state did not simply collapse under the weight of German aggression. It was carved up according to a secret protocol attached to a non-aggression pact signed weeks earlier between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact included terms that divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, with the casual precision of men drawing lines on a map over dinner. On September 17th, while Polish forces were still engaged with German units, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. Poland was crushed between two totalitarian powers that officially despised each other but had no trouble coordinating occupation schedules. The Soviets and Germans even held joint military parades in captured Polish cities. Photographs exist. Officers from both armies stood side by side while their tanks rolled past in synchronized columns. This fact is rarely emphasized because it complicates the narrative. The Allies would later fight alongside the Soviet Union, so acknowledging that the Soviets helped start the war the same way the Nazis did creates uncomfortable questions about the consistency of moral judgment. The Nazi regime did not invent systematic violence. It inherited bureaucratic models from prior European colonial administrations and refined them with industrial methods. When the decision was made to isolate and eventually eliminate Jewish populations across occupied Europe, the infrastructure already existed. Railways ran on schedule. Census records identified demographics with precision. Legal departments drafted policies that redefined citizenship, property rights, and human status through amendments and decrees. The language was procedural. Terms like resettlement, special treatment, and evacuation appeared in official memoranda. None of these words mentioned death, but everyone involved understood what they meant. The system functioned because it required no one person to feel responsible for the entire outcome. A train conductor moved cargo. A clerk processed paperwork. A guard followed posted regulations. The mechanisms of genocide were distributed across thousands of ordinary job functions. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units that followed German armies into the Soviet Union, operated under clear chains of command and filed daily reports. These were not rogue death squads. They were official police units with assigned territories and quotas. Reports detailing the number of people shot in a given village on a given day were typed, copied, filed, and sent up the hierarchy. Some of these documents survived the war. The tone is administrative. The format resembles inventory lists. In one report from a unit operating near Kiev in late 1941, the text notes that operations proceeded smoothly despite weather challenges and that ammunition supplies were adequate. The event described involved the murder of more than 33,000 people over 2 days at a ravine called Babi Yar. The report does not use the word murder. It uses terms like executive actions and processing. The bureaucracy absorbed atrocity and translated it into paperwork that could be filed alphabetically. The Allied powers were aware of many of these events long before the war ended, but the information was often downplayed or ignored because it did not serve immediate strategic purposes. British intelligence intercepted German police communications and decoded references to mass shootings in occupied Soviet territories as early as 1941. The numbers were staggering. Decrypted messages mentioned tens of thousands of executions in single operations. This intelligence was classified and shared only within restricted circles. Public statements from Allied governments rarely specified what was happening to Jewish populations. When pressed by advocacy groups to issue stronger condemnations or take direct action, officials cited concerns about inflaming anti-Semitic sentiment in their own countries or appearing to fight the war for Jewish interests rather than national security. The calculus was cold. Saving civilian populations in occupied territory was not deemed militarily essential. Bombing campaigns focused on industrial and military targets. Proposals to bomb railway lines leading to extermination camps were reviewed and rejected on the grounds that such missions would divert resources from strategic objectives. The decision was not made out of cruelty. It was made because saving lives was not part of the mission parameters. Concentration camps operated as economic enterprises. Prisoners were leased to private companies as laborers. Corporations submitted requests for workers and negotiated rates with SS administrative offices. Factories were built adjacent to camp facilities to minimize transportation costs. The labor was unpaid and expendable, which made it highly profitable. Companies like IG Farben, Siemens, and Volkswagen used camp labor to fulfill wartime contracts. After the war, many of these firms returned to normal operations. Some paid modest settlements decades later. Others never acknowledged the arrangements. The legal framework that enabled this was created through standard contracting procedures. Prisoners were classified as state assets. Their labor could be requisitioned like any other resource. There was no moral deliberation embedded in the transaction. It was simply a cost-saving measure implemented during a period of labor shortages. Medical experiments conducted in camps were framed as scientific research and were sometimes funded through grants from academic and military institutions. Doctors submitted proposals outlining hypotheses and methodologies. Approval was granted through formal review processes. Experiments included exposure to extreme cold, high-altitude simulation, infectious disease transmission, and surgical procedures performed without anesthesia. Subjects were selected from prisoner populations based on availability and perceived expendability. Results were documented in journals and some findings were presented at medical conferences. After the war, several of these doctors resumed academic careers. Data from the experiments were occasionally cited in post-war research, which created ethical dilemmas about whether knowledge obtained through torture retained scientific value. The question was never fully resolved. Some data were used, some were suppressed. The line between usable knowledge and tainted evidence remained blurred. The German military was not uniformly ideological, but it was deeply complicit. The Wehrmacht, the regular armed forces, participated in mass killings, enforced starvation policies, and facilitated deportations. Orders were issued through normal command structures. Soldiers were told that certain populations were security threats and that extreme measures were necessary. Many followed these orders without objection. Post-war narratives promoted by former German officers depicted the Wehrmacht as a professional force distinct from the SS and uninvolved in atrocities. This was false. Documents, photographs, and testimony from occupied regions confirm widespread involvement. The myth persisted because it was convenient. Western powers needed to rebuild West Germany as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. Rehabilitating the image of the German military made rearmament politically feasible. Former Wehrmacht officers were integrated into NATO command structures. Their war records were quietly overlooked. The Soviet Union's conduct during the war mirrored many of the practices it opposed in its enemies. When Soviet forces advanced westward after 1943, they engaged in systematic looting, mass rape, and summary executions. German civilians in East Prussia and Silesia fled in enormous numbers, aware of what awaited them. Estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of women were assaulted by Soviet soldiers during the occupation of Germany. Soviet military leadership did not effectively prohibit this behavior. In some cases, it was implicitly endorsed as revenge for German atrocities in Soviet territory. Discipline was selectively enforced. The violence was understood as a form of collective punishment. Soviet war correspondents and officers who documented these events were censored. Photographs and reports were confiscated. The official narrative emphasized liberation, not retribution. Evidence of large-scale sexual violence only emerged decades later through witness testimony and declassified records. Allied bombing campaigns against German and Japanese cities were designed to destroy civilian morale and economic capacity. This was not incidental damage, it was strategic doctrine. The firebombing of cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Tokyo created firestorms that killed tens of thousands in single nights. Planners selected targets based on factors like housing density, construction materials, and weather conditions to maximize destruction. After the raid on Dresden in February 1945, the city burned for days. Estimates of the dead ranged from 25,000 to over 100,000 depending on the source. The strategic value of the target was debated even at the time. Some military analysts questioned whether the destruction was justified given the late stage of the war and the limited military infrastructure in the city. The raids continued. The reasoning was that total war required total methods. Civilians were part of the war economy. Destroying their homes and lives was militarily rational. The use of atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 is often presented as a necessary act that ended the war and saved lives by avoiding a ground invasion of Japan. This justification simplifies a more complex decision-making process. Japan was already devastated by conventional bombing and naval blockade. Its military capacity was crippled. Internal communications intercepted by American intelligence indicated that Japanese leadership was divided on surrender terms, with some factions willing to capitulate if the emperor's status was guaranteed. The United States demanded unconditional surrender, but ultimately allowed the emperor to remain after the atomic bombings, which suggests the condition was negotiable. The decision to use atomic weapons was influenced by multiple factors, including a desire to demonstrate the weapon's power to the Soviet Union, justifying the enormous cost of the Manhattan Project, and ending the war quickly to limit Soviet territorial gains in Asia. The bombs killed over 200,000 people, most of them civilians. The deaths were instantaneous for some, agonizingly slow for others. Radiation sickness lasted weeks. Survivors suffered for decades. The moral weight of the decision was acknowledged privately by some officials, but publicly defended as a military necessity. Prisoner of war treatment varied wildly depending on who held whom. Soviet prisoners in German custody died in staggering numbers, often deliberately starved or worked to death. German estimates suggest that over 3 million Soviet POWs died in captivity. This was not accidental neglect. It was policy. Nazi ideology classified Slavic peoples as racially inferior, and feeding them was considered wasteful. Many were held in open-air enclosures without shelter through winter. Thousands froze or succumbed to disease within weeks. German prisoners held by the Soviets faced similar brutality. Hundreds of thousands died in Soviet camps from malnutrition, forced labor, and exposure. Some were not released until the mid-1950s, a decade after the war ended. Western Allied treatment of German POWs was generally better, but not without serious issues. In the immediate aftermath of Germany's surrender, the U.S. Army held hundreds of thousands of captured German soldiers in open-air camps along the Rhine with inadequate food, water, and shelter. Conditions were harsh. Exact death tolls remain disputed, but credible estimates range from thousands to tens of thousands. The legal classification of these prisoners was changed to disarmed enemy forces rather than prisoners of war, which exempted them from certain protections under the Geneva Conventions. This reclassification was procedural. It allowed reduced rations and oversight. People died as a result of administrative categories. Collaboration with occupying forces occurred in every occupied country. In France, the Vichy government cooperated with German authorities and implemented its own anti-Jewish laws before the Germans demanded them. French police arrested Jewish families and handed them over to German forces for deportation. Local officials maintained public order under occupation. The infrastructure of collaboration was vast and involved thousands of people in administrative, police, and business roles. After liberation, France engaged in a selective purge. Some collaborators were executed or imprisoned. Many others were quietly reintegrated into society. The scope of collaboration was downplayed in post-war French memory to preserve national cohesion. Similar patterns unfolded across Europe. In the Netherlands, Norway, Belgium, and Greece, local populations included individuals who assisted occupiers, whether out of ideological alignment, opportunism, or coercion. Post-war justice was inconsistent. Punishment often depended on political expediency rather than the severity of actions. The Holocaust was not hidden from those living near camps and ghettos. Camps were located in populated areas. Trains carrying prisoners passed through towns on regular rail lines. Factories using camp labor employed civilian managers and engineers who traveled to the sites. Smoke from crematoria was visible for miles. The smell was unmistakable. People knew, even if they did not know specifics. Silence was maintained through a combination of fear, indifference, and complicity. Speaking out carried risks, but so did many other acts of resistance that some individuals chose to undertake. The absence of widespread opposition cannot be attributed solely to coercion. Many people simply prioritized their own survival and accepted the violence around them as someone else's problem. This was not unique to Germany. In occupied countries, local populations often remained passive while their Jewish neighbors were deported. The phenomenon was widespread. Ordinary life continued alongside atrocity. Markets operated. Children attended school. People went to work. The coexistence of normalcy and horror was possible because the systems were designed to compartmentalize. Looting of art, gold, and personal property from Jewish families and occupied territories was systematic and bureaucratic. Special units catalogued and transported stolen goods. Art collections were inventoried and distributed to museums or private collections in Germany. Gold, including dental fillings extracted from corpses, was melted down and deposited in banks. Switzerland, officially neutral, accepted gold from Germany throughout the war, some of which was later confirmed to have originated from looted sources. Swiss banks also held assets deposited by Jewish families who were subsequently killed, and after the war, many of these accounts were not returned to heirs due to strict documentation requirements that victims' families could not meet. Neutrality was profitable. Sweden sold iron ore to Germany. Spain provided strategic materials. Portugal facilitated transactions. Neutral countries maintained trade relationships with both sides and profited from wartime demand. Moral positions were flexible when economic interests were at stake. Forced labor was not limited to concentration camps. Millions of civilians from occupied territories were deported to Germany to work in factories, farms, and mines. The program was called Zwangsarbeit, and it was organized by government labor offices that set quotas and arranged transportation. Workers were housed in barracks, underfed, and subjected to harsh conditions. They were not paid or were paid nominal amounts that could only be spent in company stores. The system resembled industrial slavery. After the war, many of these workers were stranded far from home in a destroyed country. Repatriation was slow and chaotic. Some never returned. Compensation was debated for decades. When payments were finally made, they were often minimal and came long after most survivors had died. The treatment of disabled individuals in Nazi Germany predated the war, but expanded during it. The T4 program, named after the address of its headquarters, systematically killed people with physical and mental disabilities. Victims were selected based on medical records, transported to designated facilities, and killed using carbon monoxide gas. Families were sent letters notifying them of sudden deaths from illnesses like pneumonia. The program killed over 70,000 people before it was officially halted in 1941 after protests from religious leaders. Unofficially, killings continued in a more decentralized manner. The methods and personnel from T4 were later used to develop the extermination camps. The program was a testing ground. It established protocols, trained staff, and normalized the concept of life unworthy of life. The legal framework was created by doctors and lawyers who argued that such measures were rational public health policy. Sexual violence was pervasive across all theaters of the war. German forces committed mass rape in occupied Soviet territories. Japanese forces operated a system of sexual slavery euphemistically called comfort women, forcing tens of thousands of women from Korea, China, the Philippines, and other regions into military brothels. These women were often abducted or deceived with false offers of employment. Conditions were brutal. Many did not survive. After the war, the Japanese government denied responsibility for decades. Official acknowledgement came slowly and reluctantly. Compensation remained contentious. Soviet soldiers committed widespread sexual violence during their advance into Eastern Europe, as previously noted. American and British forces also committed rapes, though at a smaller scale and with some level of prosecution in military courts. French colonial troops, particularly North African soldiers serving in the French army, were involved in mass rapes during the Italian campaign. Estimates vary, but thousands of Italian women were assaulted. The French command's response was inadequate. Some cases were prosecuted, many were not. The violence was often dismissed as an inevitable byproduct of war. Partisans and resistance fighters operated in occupied territories, and their actions often prompted brutal reprisals against civilian populations. When German soldiers were killed by resistance attacks, occupying forces responded by executing hostages or destroying entire villages. The ratio varied. In some cases, 50 or 100 civilians were killed for every German soldier. In others, whole communities were annihilated. The massacres were intended as deterrents. They were publicly announced. Notices were posted listing the names of those executed and the reasons. Resistance groups faced moral dilemmas. Their attacks achieved limited military results, but triggered mass killings of civilians. Some groups moderated their tactics. Others continued, accepting civilian casualties as a cost of resistance. Post-war narratives celebrated resistance movements without fully grappling with these complexities. Resistance became a symbol of national honor. The consequences for uninvolved civilians were less emphasized. The death marches that occurred in the final months of the war as camps were evacuated killed tens of thousands. Prisoners were forced to walk hundreds of miles in winter without adequate clothing, food, or rest. Those who collapsed were shot. The marches had no clear strategic purpose. The war was lost. The camps could have been abandoned. Instead, authorities chose to move prisoners deeper into shrinking German territory, seemingly unable to deviate from procedural norms, even as the state collapsed. Guards continued to follow orders. Prisoners continued to march. People died on roadsides and in forests. Local German civilians saw the columns pass. Some offered help. Most did not. The marches continued until Allied forces physically intercepted them, or until guards simply abandoned their posts. Denazification, the Allied effort to remove Nazi influence from German society after the war, was inconsistent and ultimately superficial. Millions of Germans had been party members, and prosecuting all of them was impractical. Questionnaires were distributed asking individuals to disclose their affiliations and activities. Responses were often dishonest. Verification was limited. Many former Nazis were reclassified as fellow travelers or nominal participants and faced few consequences. In both West and East Germany, former party members were reintegrated into government, business, and academia because their expertise was needed. The Cold War made thorough denazification less important than stability and reconstruction. Intelligence agencies actively recruited former Nazi officials. The US brought German scientists to America under Operation Paperclip, overlooking their party membership and, in some cases, their use of slave labor. The Soviet Union did the same. Expertise in rocketry and chemical engineering outweighed moral considerations. War criminals, who were not prominent enough to be tried at Nuremberg or other tribunals, often lived out their lives quietly. The Nuremberg trials established important legal precedents, but only prosecuted a small fraction of those responsible for atrocities. 24 major war criminals were tried in the main trial. Subsequent trials addressed specific groups like doctors, judges, and industrialists. Convictions were secured, and some defendants were executed. But the trials were selective. They focused on leaders and symbolic figures. The vast majority of individuals who participated in the implementation of genocidal policies were never charged. Many lived ordinary post-war lives. Some expressed regret, many did not. The trials also reflected the interests of the victors. Soviet crimes were not addressed. Allied actions, like the bombings of civilian populations, were outside the scope. The legal framework was constructed to judge one side. Justice was partial. Displaced persons camps in Europe after the war housed millions of refugees, including Holocaust survivors, former forced laborers, and ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe. Conditions in some camps were poor. Former concentration camps were repurposed to hold displaced persons, which meant survivors sometimes found themselves behind the same barbed wire that had imprisoned them during the war. Administration was chaotic. Food and medical care were inadequate in many locations. Emigration opportunities were limited. Countries were reluctant to accept large numbers of refugees. The United States maintained restrictive immigration quotas. British-controlled Palestine restricted Jewish immigration despite intense demand. Survivors spent months or years in limbo. Frustration and despair were common. Some displaced persons camps remained operational into the 1950s. The division of Europe after the war was determined by military positions at the time of Germany's surrender and by agreements made at conferences in Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam. Populations were moved across borders in massive forced migrations. Millions of ethnic Germans were expelled from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other countries. Estimates suggest that over 12 million people were displaced, and hundreds of thousands died during the expulsions due to violence, exposure, and starvation. The expulsions were brutal but received limited international criticism because they were seen as justified retribution. Borders were redrawn. Entire regions changed hands. People who had lived in one country for generations suddenly found themselves in another or were forced to leave. The reshaping of the map was conducted with little regard for the individuals affected. Strategic and political considerations dominated. Japanese war crimes in Asia were extensive and included massacres, human experimentation, and widespread use of sexual slavery. The Nanjing Massacre in 1937 involved the mass killing and rape of Chinese civilians over several weeks. Estimates of the dead range from tens of thousands to over 200,000. Unit 731, a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit, conducted experiments on live prisoners, including vivisection, forced infection with diseases, and exposure to extreme conditions. Thousands died. After the war, the United States granted immunity to Unit 731 researchers in exchange for their data. The information was classified and used in American biological warfare programs. No one from Unit 731 was prosecuted for war crimes. Japanese wartime conduct was addressed in the Tokyo trials, where senior political and military leaders were prosecuted. Some were executed. But the emperor, who held symbolic and actual authority, was not charged. American occupation authorities decided that maintaining the emperor was essential for political stability. His role in wartime decisions was minimized in the proceedings. Accountability was shaped by post-war political needs. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed more people in a single night than either atomic bomb. Estimates range from 80,000 to over 100,000 dead. The raid used incendiary bombs designed to ignite the wooden structures that dominated the city. Flames spread rapidly. Firestorms created winds strong enough to uproot trees. People suffocated in shelters as fires consumed oxygen. Rivers boiled. The attack was planned to maximize civilian casualties and destruction of residential areas. It succeeded. The strategic justification was that Tokyo's residential districts housed small-scale war production. The reality was that the bombing aimed to break the will of the Japanese population. Similar raids targeted other Japanese cities. By the time the atomic bombs were dropped, Much of urban Japan had already been destroyed by conventional bombing. Food was used as a weapon throughout the war. The German occupation of the Soviet Union included plans to deliberately starve millions of Soviet citizens to free up resources for German use. The Hunger Plan, drafted before the invasion, anticipated the deaths of tens of millions through enforced famine. Implementation was uneven, but mass starvation did occur in besieged cities like Leningrad, where over 1 million people died during a blockade that lasted nearly 900 days. People ate wallpaper paste, leather, and sawdust. Corpses were found with flesh removed. Cannibalism occurred. The blockade was maintained by German forces with the explicit intention of starving the city into submission. Relief efforts were blocked. Supplies that did arrive were minimal. The British imposed a blockade on occupied Europe that contributed to food shortages and suffering among civilian populations. Greece experienced a famine in 1941 and 1942 that killed hundreds of thousands, partly due to Axis occupation policies, but also exacerbated by the Allied blockade, which prevented neutral countries from sending relief. The blockade was maintained because it was strategically useful. Starvation was collateral damage. The scale of death in the war is difficult to comprehend. Estimates suggest that over 60 million people died, including around 40 million civilians. The Soviet Union lost more than 20 million, with some estimates higher. Poland lost roughly 6 million, half of whom were Jewish. China lost 15 to 20 million. Germany lost over 6 million. The numbers are approximations. Many deaths were never recorded. Entire communities disappeared. The dead included soldiers, civilians, men, women, children, the elderly, the disabled, the healthy. Cause of death varied. Combat, bombing, starvation, disease, execution, exposure, overwork, neglect. The mechanisms of death were diverse, but the scale was enabled by industrial and bureaucratic capacity. Societies organized themselves to produce death efficiently, and they succeeded. After the war, many nations engaged in myth-making to process the trauma and construct useful narratives. Britain emphasized resilience and unity during the Blitz. France highlighted resistance while downplaying collaboration. The Soviet Union portrayed the war as a patriotic struggle and suppressed narratives that complicated the heroism. The United States framed the war as a righteous crusade and emphasized liberation while avoiding difficult questions about delayed interventions and selective justice. Germany was divided and underwent different reckoning processes in East and West, neither of which fully confronted the breadth of complicity. Japan's post-war narrative minimized aggression and emphasized suffering from the atomic bombs, which allowed for a victim identity that obscured responsibility for atrocities in Asia. These narratives served political purposes. They facilitated reconstruction, national cohesion, and alliance formation during the Cold War. They were not entirely false, but they were incomplete. The war did not resolve the ideological conflicts that fueled it. Fascism was militarily defeated, but authoritarian governance continued in many forms. The Soviet Union expanded its influence over Eastern Europe and maintained a totalitarian system for decades. Colonial empires, weakened by the war, began to collapse, but the process was violent and protracted. Decolonization wars in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East killed millions in the decades following World War II. The technologies of mass killing developed during the war were refined and spread. Nuclear weapons proliferated. Conventional warfare incorporated lessons learned from strategic bombing and total war doctrines. The institutions created after the war, like the United Nations and international courts, established frameworks for addressing atrocities, but enforcement depended on political will, which remained inconsistent. The war ended because one side ran out of resources and the capacity to continue fighting. Germany surrendered in May 1945 after Soviet forces took Berlin and Allied armies occupied the country from the west. Japan surrendered in August after 2 atomic bombs, and a Soviet invasion of Manchuria made further resistance untenable. The decisions to surrender were pragmatic. Continuation meant annihilation. The wars in Europe and Asia stopped, but the systems that had enabled industrial-scale violence, the bureaucracies, the legal structures, the economic incentives, the willing populations, did not disappear. They were reabsorbed into peacetime societies, adapted, and in many cases repurposed for new conflicts.